On a rain-soaked afternoon in Hartford, 1860, the city's finest gathered beneath the flickering glow of gaslight and the heavy scent of lily. The church was a cathedral of hope, its pews crowded with faces flushed by anticipation and the promise of new beginnings. Outside, the world was gray and uncertain, but within these walls, the air shimmered with the fragile magic of a wedding day. The bride, radiant in white silk, moved like a ghost through the crowd, her smile trembling, her eyes bright with the fever of youth and dreams. She was the picture of innocence, a living emblem of all that was pure and possible. But beneath the surface, something else stirred. A chill, almost imperceptible, crept through the congregation. Some would later say they felt it a shiver down the spine, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The groom, handsome and nervous, clutched her hand a little too tightly. The mother-in-law, regal and composed, sat in the front row, her gaze fixed and unreadable. There were whispers, of course, there always are. Whispers about family fortunes, about old grudges, about the peculiar tension that seemed to hang between the two women at the heart of this celebration. The ceremony unfolded with all the expected rituals, the exchange of vows, the trembling of hands, the soft murmur of prayers. And then, as the couple turned to face their guests, a sudden gasp cut through the silence. The bride's face drained of color, her knees buckled. In a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she collapsed, her bouquet scattering across the polished floor. The music faltered. The guests froze, their joy curdling into horror. In the days that followed, Hartford would be gripped by a fever of speculation and dread. What had happened to the bride? Was it a cruel twist of fate or something far more sinister? Tonight, we peel back the layers of respectability and ritual and step into the shadows behind the wedding veil. What really happened behind those closed doors? And how could love, in all its promise, become a weapon? Stay with me, for the answers are darker than you can imagine. Hartford in 1860 was a city poised on the knife edge of transformation. Its streets, lined with stately elms and grand Victorian homes, whispered of old money and new ambition. The city's skyline, such as it was, bristled with the spires of churches and the chimneys of factories, symbols of faith and industry, tradition and progress, all jostling for dominance in the restless heart of New England. Carriages rattled over cobblestone roads, their wheels splashing through puddles left by the spring rains, while the air carried the mingled scents of horse sweat, coal smoke, and the faint, sweet promise of lilacs blooming in hidden gardens. To the casual observer, Hartford was a city of refinement and order. Its citizens prided themselves on their manners, their education, their sense of civic duty. The men wore tailored frock coats and top hats, their faces stern with the weight of responsibility. The women, corseted and gloved, glided through parlors and tea rooms, their conversations a delicate dance of wit and propriety. The city's elite gathered at the Wadsworth Athenaeum for art and music, or strolled the manicured lawns of Bushnell Park, exchanging pleasantries beneath the watchful eyes of their peers. Yet beneath this polished veneer, Hartford was a city, haunted by its own contradictions. The wealth that built its grandest homes was often stained by the sweat of factory workers and the silent suffering of servants. The city's prosperity was a fragile thing, threatened by the distant rumblings of war and the ever-present specter of disease. In the shadowed alleys behind the stately homes, poverty festered. Children with hollow eyes darted between the legs of passers-by, and the desperate sometimes vanished without a trace, their stories swallowed by the city's hunger for progress. There was a tension in the air, a sense that the old ways were slipping away, replaced by something colder and more uncertain. The newspapers, thick with advertisements for patent medicines and tales of distant gold rushes, also carried stories. of scandal and ruin. A banker's suicide, a factory fire, a child lost to fever, each tragedy was a reminder that beneath the city's genteel surface, chaos lurked, waiting for its moment to break through. Hartford's social circles were tight and unforgiving. Reputation was everything, and a single misstep could mean exile from polite society. Families guarded their secrets with a ferocity born of desperation. Behind closed doors, marriages were brokered like business deals. Fortunes were gambled on risky ventures, and resentment simmered, unspoken but ever present. The city's churches preached forgiveness and charity, but in the drawing rooms and parlors, judgment was swift and merciless. It was in this world of contrasts of light and shadow, hope and fear, that the ill-fated wedding took place. They, bride's family, old money, and proud lineage, represented the city's storied past. The groom's family, newly wealthy and eager for acceptance, embodied its uncertain future. Their union was meant to be a symbol of Hartford's promise, a bridge between tradition and progress. But as the city would soon learn, even the grandest facades can conceal rot, and the most joyous occasions can become the stage for tragedy. As the wedding day approached, the city buzzed with anticipation. Invitations were delivered by hand, each one a ticket to an event that promised to be the highlight of the season. The church was decorated with white roses and trailing ivy, a vision of innocence and hope. But in the quiet corners of Hartford, away from the laughter and music, there were whispers of old grudges, of jealousies that refused to die, of secrets that could destroy everything if brought to light. Hartford, 1860, a city of contrasts, where every shadow hid a story, and every celebration carried the seeds of its own undoing. At the heart of this tragedy were two families, each a mirror reflecting the city's own contradictions, one rooted in the old soil of Hartford, the other reaching hungrily for the fruits of new prosperity. Their union, at least on paper, was a perfect match, a blending of lineage and ambition, tradition and progress. But beneath the surface, the story was far more complicated and far more dangerous. The bride, Clara Winthrop, was the last daughter of a family whose name was woven into the very fabric of Hartford's history. The Winthrops had arrived in Connecticut generations earlier, their fortunes built on shipping, land, and a reputation for unyielding respectability. Clara was raised in a house of high ceilings and hushed voices, where every gesture was measured and every word weighed. She was a gentle soul, known for her kindness and her quiet intelligence. But there was a sadness in her eyes, a sense of longing for something beyond the gilded cage of her upbringing. Her mother, Eleanor, was a woman of delicate health and even more delicate nerves, while her father, Charles, was a stern patriarch, his love expressed in the form of expectations and obligations. Clara's world was one of constraint and ritual, but she found moments of freedom in the garden, among the roses and lilacs, or in the pages of her beloved novels. She dreamed of a life less scripted, a love that would sweep her away from the suffocating weight of family legacy. When she met Jonathan Barrett, it seemed, for a moment, that her dreams might come true. Jonathan was everything Clara was not: bold, ambitious, and unafraid to challenge the old order. The Barretts were newcomers to Hartford, their wealth earned in the booming insurance trade rather than inherited from distant ancestors. Jonathan's father, Samuel, was a self-made man, proud of his rise from humble beginnings and determined that his family would be accepted among the city's elite. His mother, Lydia Barrett, was the true architect of their social ascent, a woman of formidable will, sharp intelligence, and an ironclad sense of purpose. Lydia Barrett was a figure both admired and feared in Hartford society. She had a talent for reading people, for sensing weakness and opportunity in equal measure. Her presence at any gathering was enough to shift the balance of conversation, her approval a prize to be sought, her disfavor a sentence to social oblivion. She dressed impeccably, her hair always perfectly arranged, her eyes cool and appraising. To outsiders, she was the model of Victorian womanhood, gracious, charitable, and devoted to her family. But those who knew her best understood that beneath the surface, Lydia was a force of nature, accustomed to getting her way and intolerant of anything that threatened her carefully constructed world. From the moment Jonathan announced his intention to marry Clara, Lydia's ambitions sharpened to a point. She saw in Clara not just a daughter-in-law, but a key to the city's inner sanctum, a way to cement the Barrett's place among Hartford's first families. Yet, for all her outward approval, there was a tension in Lydia's manner, a subtle edge to her words when she spoke of the Winthrops. She resented the old family's quiet condescension, their unspoken belief that money could never buy true breeding. And she watched Clara with a critical eye, measuring her every move, every word, every smile. Jonathan, caught between the two women he loved most, tried to play the peacemaker. He adored Clara for her gentleness and her quiet strength, and he admired his mother's drive and intelligence. But he was blind to the currents swirling beneath the surface, the old wounds and new ambitions that would soon collide. He believed, perhaps naively, that love could bridge any divide, that the past could be left behind in the glow of a new beginning. The engagement was announced with great fanfare, the city's newspapers printing breathless accounts of the upcoming union. The Winthrops, ever conscious of their reputation, hosted a series of elegant dinners and teas, each one a performance of grace and civility. The Barretts responded in kind, their gatherings more ostentatious, their guest lists carefully curated to include the city's most influential figures. Beneath the surface, however, the families circled each other warily, each aware of the stakes, each determined not to lose ground. It was in these gatherings that the first cracks began to show. Lydia's compliments to Clara were always tinged with faint criticism: her dress a shade too simple, her laugh a touch too loud. She offered advice on everything from table settings to conversation topics, her suggestions delivered with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Clara, eager to please, tried to adapt, but the effort left her exhausted and uncertain. She confided in her mother, who urged patience and diplomacy, but the strain was evident in the dark circles beneath Clara's eyes. Jonathan, meanwhile, grew frustrated with the endless negotiations, the subtle power plays that seemed to define every interaction. He longed for a simple happiness, a life free from the burdens of expectation and ambition. But he was his mother's son, and he could not entirely escape the web she had spun around him. As the wedding day approached, the tension between the families became almost palpable. The Winthrops clung to their traditions, their sense of superiority, while the Barretts pushed for recognition and acceptance. Lydia's control over the wedding arrangements was near absolute. Every detail, from the guest list to the menu, bore her unmistakable stamp. Clara, the bride, found herself swept along by forces she could barely comprehend, her own wishes lost in the tide of other people's ambitions. Yet for all the conflict and maneuvering, there were moments of genuine tenderness. Jonathan and Clara, in stolen moments away from prying eyes, spoke of their hopes and fears, their dreams for a future together. They clung to each other, believing that love would be enough to weather any storm. But in the shadows, old wounds festered, and the seeds of tragedy were already taking root. The stage was set, the players assembled, and the first act of this dark drama was about to begin. The morning of the wedding dawned with a sky the color of tarnished silver, clouds pressing low over Hartford, as if the heavens themselves were reluctant to bless the day. Yet inside the Winthrop home, the mood was one of orchestrated celebration. Servants hurried through the halls, arms laden with bouquets of white roses and trailing ivy, their faces flushed with the urgency of last-minute preparations. The scent of beeswax and fresh flowers mingled in the air, a heady perfume that clung to every surface. Clara sat before her dressing table, her reflection pale and luminous in the glass. Her mother fussed with the lace at her collar, hands trembling. As she pinned a sprig of myrtle, an old symbol of love and fidelity, into her daughter's hair, Clara's heart fluttered with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She tried to steady her breathing, to focus on the gentle words of encouragement from her mother, but her mind kept drifting to the uneasy dreams that had haunted her sleep. In them, she wandered through endless corridors, always searching, always just out of reach of something she could not name. Downstairs, the Barretts arrived in a flurry of carriages and crisp morning attire. Lydia Barrett swept into the foyer, her presence commanding, her eyes sharp as she surveyed the arrangements. She offered compliments with a practiced smile, but her gaze lingered on every detail, searching for imperfections. When she greeted Clara, her words were warm, but her grip on the bride's hands was just a shade too firm, her eyes lingering a moment too long. "You look lovely, my dear," she said, her voice low. "Today, you become a Barrett. Remember, appearances are everything." The church was a vision of Victorian splendor. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting the pews in jewel tones. The guests, Hartford's finest, filled the sanctuary with a low hum of conversation, their voices rising and falling like the tide. Ladies in silk and tulle exchanged glances, their fans fluttering as they whispered behind gloved hands. Gentlemen stood in small knots, discussing business and politics, but their eyes were drawn again and again to the front of the church, where the drama of the day would soon unfold. As the organist began the first notes of the processional, a hush fell over the congregation. Clara entered on her father's arm, her veil trailing behind her like a wisp of cloud. She moved with a grace that belied the turmoil within, her eyes fixed on Jonathan waiting at the altar. He looked back at her with a mixture of pride and vulnerability, his hands twisting nervously at his sides. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The ceremony itself was a tapestry of tradition. Vows were exchanged, hands joined, rings slipped onto trembling fingers. The minister's voice echoed through the vaulted space, solemn and reassuring. Yet beneath the surface, there were ripples of unease. A bridesmaid stumbled on her way to the altar, her face flushing as she righted herself. A candle guttered and nearly went out, only to flare back to life at the last moment. In the pews, a child began to cry, her mother shushing her with a look of embarrassment. Lydia Barrett watched it all with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Her eyes flicked from Clara to Jonathan, from the minister to the assembled guests. At one point, she leaned over to whisper something to her husband, her lips barely moving. He nodded, his expression unreadable. There was a sense, among those who noticed, that Lydia was not merely a participant in the day's events, but a conductor, orchestrating every note. After the ceremony, the guests spilled out onto the church steps, laughter and congratulations filling the air. The newlyweds posed for photographs, their smiles bright but brittle. Clara felt the weight of every gaze, every expectation pressing down on her. She clung to Jonathan's arm, grateful for his steady presence, but even he seemed distracted, his eyes darting to his mother, who stood apart from the crowd, her face a mask of satisfaction. The reception was held in the Winthrop Garden, a riot of color and fragrance beneath the brooding sky. Tables groaned under the weight of delicacies, roast pheasant, sugared fruits, towering cakes. Champagne flowed freely, and the guests toasted, the couple with increasing exuberance. Yet for all the outward joy, there were undercurrents of tension. Old friends exchanged wary glances, rivals measured each other across the lawn, and the servants whispered in corners about the strange mood that seemed to hang over the festivities. Clara moved through the crowd like a figure in a dream, accepting. Congratulations, offering polite smiles, her mind drifting. She caught snippets of conversation, an aunt remarking on her pallor, a cousin speculating about the Barrett fortune, a neighbor whispering about Lydia's ambitions. At one point, she found herself alone with her new mother-in-law, who pressed a glass of champagne into her hand. To new beginnings, Lydia said, her eyes glittering. Clara hesitated, then took a sip, the bubbles sharp and cold on her tongue. As the afternoon wore on, the sky darkened, and a chill wind swept through. The garden. The guests began to gather for the cutting of the cake, their laughter growing louder, more forced. Clara felt a wave of dizziness, a sudden weakness in her limbs. She tried to steady herself, to focus on Jonathan's voice as he led her to the center of the crowd. But the world seemed to tilt, the faces around her blurring into a swirl of color and sound. Then, without warning, Clara's knees buckled. The glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the flagstones. She gasped, clutching at her chest, her breath coming in short, desperate bursts. The guests fell silent, their joy turning to confusion. Then fear. Jonathan caught her as she fell, his face white with shock. Lydia pushed through the crowd, her expression unreadable, her hands reaching out, but stopping just short of her daughter-in-law's trembling form. In that moment, the celebration shattered. The music faltered, the laughter died, and a terrible silence descended over the garden. Clara lay motionless, her white dress stained with spilled champagne, her eyes wide and unseeing. The wedding, that had begun in hope and promise, ended in horror and disbelief, leaving a city and two families forever changed. Panic swept through the garden like a sudden storm. Guests surged forward, their faces twisted in shock and disbelief, as Jonathan cradled Clara's limp body in his arms. Her skin, so luminous only moments before, had taken on a waxen pallor. Her lips, parted in a silent plea, were tinged with an unnatural blue. The world seemed to contract around her, the laughter and music of the wedding, now a distant, mocking echo. Eleanor Winthrop, Clara's mother, collapsed beside her daughter, her cries piercing the stunned silence. Charles Winthrop, usually so, composed, barked frantic orders for a doctor, his voice cracking with desperation. Servants scattered, some running for help, others frozen in place, their hands pressed to their mouths. Lydia Barrett stood at the edge of the chaos, her face a mask of composure, her eyes fixed on Clara with an intensity that did not go unnoticed. Within minutes, the city's most respected physician, Dr. Edwin Harrow, arrived, his black bag swinging. At his side, he knelt beside Clara, checking her pulse, examining her eyes, searching for any sign of life. The guests watched in breathless silence, hope flickering and dying as the doctor's expression grew grim. He shook his head, and a collective GASP rippled through the crowd. Clara Winthrop Barrett, bride of barely an hour, was gone. Grief descended like a shroud. The garden emptied, guests fleeing the scene, their faces pale with shock and fear. The Winthrop home became a house of mourning, its windows shuttered, its halls echoing with the sound of weeping. Jonathan wandered the rooms in a daze, his mind refusing to accept the reality of his loss. Eleanor retreated to her bed, refusing food and comfort, while Charles threw himself into the business of death arranging for the body, consulting with doctors, demanding answers. But even as the family grieved, whispers began to circulate. Clara had been young, healthy, full of life. How could she have died so suddenly, so violently? The official explanation, heart failure, perhaps brought on by excitement satisfied. No one, the servants, always the first to sense trouble, exchanged knowing glances. Some spoke of the strange color of Clara's lips, the way her body had convulsed before she fell. Others remembered the glass of champagne pressed into her hand. By Lydia Barrett, the way the older woman had hovered at her side throughout the afternoon. It did not take long for suspicion to take root. Hartford was a city that thrived on gossip, and the story of the tragic wedding spread like wildfire. In the parlors and drawing rooms, at the market and the church, people speculated in hushed tones. Some blamed the Winthrops, suggesting that Clara had been too delicate for the pressures of marriage. Others pointed to the Barretts, their rapid rise and relentless ambition, making them easy targets for envy and mistrust. But again and again, the conversation returned to Lydia Barrett. She had always been a figure of fascination, admired for her poise, feared for her sharp tongue and sharper mind. Now, every gesture, every word she had spoken in the days leading up to the wedding was scrutinized for hidden meaning. Had she resented Clara's place in her son's life? Had she seen the marriage as a threat to her own influence? Had she, in a moment of jealousy or rage, done the unthinkable? The rumors grew wilder with each retelling. Some claimed to have seen Lydia slip something into Clara's drink. Others insisted that she had argued with her daughter-in-law in the hours before the ceremony. A few whispered that Lydia had been heard muttering curses under her breath, invoking old superstitions about the evil eye and the dangers of envy. The truth, whatever it was, became harder to discern with each passing day. The authorities, under pressure from both families and the public, launched an investigation. Dr. Harrow, troubled by the symptoms he had observed, ordered an autopsy. Rare and controversial step in a city that preferred its scandals to remain buried. The results were shocking. Traces of arsenic were found in Clara's stomach, enough to kill a grown man. The cause of death was no longer in doubt. Clara had been poisoned. The news sent shockwaves through Hartford. The city's newspapers, always hungry for sensation, splashed the story across their front pages. "Bride poisoned at altar," the headline screamed. "Mother-in-law suspected in shocking crime." The Winthrops demanded justice, their grief hardening into fury. The Barretts closed ranks, denying any wrongdoing, insisting that Lydia was the victim of malicious gossip. Lydia herself maintained a stoic silence. She refused to answer questions, refused to defend herself, even as the evidence mounted against her. Some saw this as proof of her guilt, others as a sign of her strength. Jonathan, torn between loyalty to his mother and love for his lost bride, withdrew from public life, his once bright future now clouded by suspicion and shame. As the investigation unfolded, the city became a cauldron of suspicion and fear. Friends turned against friends. Neighbors eyed each other with mistrust. The line between truth and rumor blurred, and the question on everyone's lips was the same. Who could be trusted? Who among them was capable of such a monstrous act? And now, I turn to you. If you had been there, in that garden, watching the events unfold, who would you have believed? Would you trust the grieving mother, the ambitious matriarch, the heartbroken groom? Or would you, like so many in Hartford, find yourself lost in the shadows of suspicion and scandal? Comment below, who do you think held the poisoned cup, and why? The answers, as you will see, are never as simple as they seem. Behind the stately facades of Hartford's grand homes, the true nature of family life was often hidden from view. The Barretts, for all their public poise and polished manners, were no exception. In the days following Clara's death, as suspicion thickened around Lydia Barrett, the city's curiosity turned inward, probing the shadows of her past for answers. What could drive a woman of such standing to commit an act so monstrous? Was it madness, malice, or something more insidious slow, corrosive poison of the soul, brewed over years of disappointment and thwarted ambition? Lydia Barrett had not always been the formidable matriarch Hartford now whispered about. She was born Lydia Crane, the daughter of a modest schoolmaster in a small Connecticut town. Her childhood was marked by scarcity and longing, her mother's. Hands always red from scrubbing, her father's eyes always fixed on the horizon, searching for a future that never quite arrived. Lydia learned early that the world was not kind to the weak. She watched her mother's quiet suffering, the way she bent beneath the weight of her husband's failures, and vowed that she would never be so powerless. When she met Samuel Barrett, a young man with ambition burning in his veins, Lydia saw her chance. Samuel was clever, tireless, and determined to make his mark. Together, they clawed their way up the social ladder, each success hard-won, each setback a lesson in the art of survival. Lydia became a master of appearances, her every gesture calculated to inspire admiration or fear. She learned to read a room in an instant, to sense the shifting tides of favor and fortune. But beneath the surface, the old anxieties never truly faded. Every slight, every whispered insult from Hartford's old families was a wound that festered in secret. When Jonathan was born, Lydia poured all her hopes and ambitions into him. He was her golden child, the living proof of her triumph over circumstance. She managed his education, his friendships, even his courtships, always with an eye toward the future she had planned. But as Jonathan grew into a man, he began to chafe against her control. He longed for independence, for a life shaped by his own desires rather than his mother's will. Lydia, sensing her influence slipping, clung tighter, her love curdling into something possessive and suffocating. The arrival of Clara Winthrop into Jonathan's life was, for Lydia, both a blessing and a threat. On the surface, Clara was the perfect bride, refined, gentle, a sign of Hartford's oldest family. But Lydia could not ignore the subtle slights. The way the Winthrops looked down their noses at the Barretts, the way Clara's very presence seemed to remind her of everything she had fought to overcome. The engagement, so celebrated in public, became a battleground in private. Lydia's advice to Clara was always laced with criticism, her gifts always carrying the weight of obligation. She watched her future daughter-in-law with a hawk's eye, searching for weakness, for any sign that Clara might not be worthy of the Barrett name. Inheritance was another shadow that loomed over the family. The Barrett fortune, though substantial, was new and precarious. Samuel's business ventures were risky, and Lydia knew that a single misstep could bring everything crashing down. The Winthrops, for all their heirs, were not as wealthy as they appeared. Their estate was mortgaged, their fortunes tied up in land and reputation. The marriage was, in many ways, a transaction, a merging of assets and influence, a way to secure the future for both families. But Lydia feared that Clara, with her delicate health and dreamy disposition, might not be up to the task. She worried that Jonathan, blinded by love, would squander everything she had built. Jealousy, too, played its part. Lydia had spent her life at the center of her son's world. Her opinion sought, her approval craved. Now she found herself displaced by a younger woman, her role diminished, her authority challenged. The transition from mother to mother-in-law was not an easy one. Lydia's identity, so long defined by her ability to control and protect, began to unravel. She became restless, irritable, prone to sudden outbursts of anger or tears. Servants whispered that she wandered the halls at night, her footsteps echoing through the empty rooms, her mind racing with fears she could not name. There were other, darker rumors as well. Some said that Lydia's own mother had suffered from nervous ailments, that madness ran in the Crane bloodline. Others recalled incidents from Lydia's youth, a violent argument with a childhood friend, a beloved, pet found dead under mysterious circumstances. These stories, half remembered and embellished with each retelling, painted a picture of a woman haunted by her own demons, teetering on the edge of sanity. In the weeks before the wedding, those closest to Lydia noticed a change in her. She became obsessed with the details of the ceremony, insisting on overseeing every aspect herself. She argued with Samuel over the guest list, berated the servants for imagined slights, and questioned Jonathan endlessly about his feelings for Clara. Her letters to friends grew erratic, filled with wild accusations and pleas for understanding. Some wondered if the pressure of the occasion had simply become too much, if Lydia's mind had finally buckled under the weight of her own expectations. Yet in public, Lydia remained the picture of composure. She attended church, hosted teas, and smiled for the neighbors, her grief at Clara's death expressed in carefully measured words. But those who looked closely saw the cracks in her facade, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching, the haunted look in her eyes when she believed herself alone. She spoke less and less to Samuel, retreating into her own world of memories and regrets. The investigation into Clara's death only deepened Lydia's isolation. She refused to answer questions, refused to defend herself, as if she believed that her silence could somehow shield her from the storm raging outside. Some saw this as an admission of guilt, others as a sign of her unraveling mind. Jonathan, torn between love and loyalty, withdrew from both his mother and his father, unable to reconcile the woman who had raised him with the figure now at the center of the citywide scandal. Behind closed doors, the Barrett home became a place of secrets and suspicion. Servants whispered in the corridors, their eyes darting to Lydia's door. Samuel spent long hours at his office, avoiding the house whenever possible. Lydia herself became a ghost, drifting from room to room, her mind trapped in a labyrinth of fear and longing. The public respectability that had defined the Barretts for so long was now a brittle shell, barely containing the chaos within. And so, the question remains, was Lydia Barrett a cold-blooded killer, driven by jealousy and the need for control? Or was she a victim of her own history, undone by the very ambitions that had once made her formidable? Was her silence a shield or a confession? In the end, the line between motive and madness is as thin and fragile as a wedding veil, easily torn, impossible to mend. What do you believe? Was Lydia's fate sealed by her own choices, or by the relentless pressures of a world that demanded perfection at any cost? Behind every closed door, there is a story waiting to be told, a story of love, ambition, and wounds that never truly heal. The city of Hartford, still reeling from the shock of Clara's death, became a crucible of rumor and revelation. The investigation into her poisoning unfolded not only in the drawing rooms of the elite, but also in the muddy streets and crowded taverns where the city's pulse beat strongest. The search for truth was a battle fought on many fronts, between science and superstition, justice and reputation, fact and the fevered imaginings of a community desperate for answers. Detective Elias Finch was assigned to the case, a man known for his methodical mind and unflinching resolve. Finch was not a native of Hartford. He had come from Boston, bringing with him the new science of criminal investigation fingerprints, chemical tests, the careful cataloging of evidence. To many, in Hartford, his methods seemed cold, almost unnatural, a sharp contrast to the city's preference for intuition and social standing. But Finch was undeterred. He began his work with a quiet determination, interviewing witnesses, collecting objects from the scene, and keeping meticulous notes in a battered leather journal dot. His first stop was the Winthrop home, now draped in mourning. The family, shattered by grief, offered little help. Eleanor was too distraught to speak, her hands twisting a handkerchief to shreds. Charles, his face drawn in gray, answered questions with clipped formality, his eyes darting away. Whenever Lydia Barrett's name was mentioned, Jonathan, pale and hollow-eyed, could only repeat the events of the day in a monotone, his mind clearly elsewhere. Finch turned his attention to the Barretts. Samuel Barrett met him with a lawyer's caution, insisting on the family's innocence. and warning against the dangers of idle gossip. Lydia, when she finally agreed to see him, was a study in contradictions, her words measured, her gaze unwavering, yet her hands betraying a tremor she could not hide. She denied any involvement, insisting that she had loved Clara as a daughter. But Finch noted the way her eyes flickered when he mentioned the glass of champagne, the way her voice caught when he asked about her relationship with her son. The physical evidence was scant. The shattered glass from which Clara had drunk was recovered, its contents sent to Dr. Harrow for analysis. The results were damning. Traces of arsenic, the same substance found in Clara's body. But how had it gotten there? Who had access to the poison, and who had the opportunity to administer it? The servants were questioned, their stories cross-examined and compared. Some remembered seeing Lydia in the kitchen that morning. Others swore she had never left the parlor. A few hinted at tensions between Lydia and Clara, but none could offer proof. As Finch dug deeper, the city itself became a character in the investigation. Hartford's social circles buzzed with speculation, each new rumor adding another layer to the mystery. Some insisted that Clara had been ill for weeks, that her death was the result of a hidden disease. Others claimed to have seen a stranger lurking near the garden, a shadowy figure with a grudge against the Winthrops. The local apothecary was questioned about recent purchases of arsenic, but his records were incomplete, and he could recall nothing unusual. Science, for all its promise, was not enough to silence the city's superstitions. Old women muttered about curses and omens, recalling the guttering candle and the bridesmaid's stumble as signs of doom. Some whispered that the Barretts were cursed, that every woman who married into the family met a tragic end. Others pointed to the Winthrops, suggesting that their pride had finally brought divine retribution. The church was filled with prayers for justice, but also with whispered bargains, pleas for secrets to remain buried, for reputations to be spared. Finch found himself caught between these worlds. He trusted in evidence, in the slow accumulation of facts, but he could not ignore the power of reputation. Every step he took was watched, every question weighed for its implications. The city's elite closed ranks, protecting their own, while the working class reveled in the spectacle, their own grievances finding voice in the scandal. The investigation became a mirror, reflecting the fears and desires of an entire community. Red herrings abounded. A servant was found with a vial of laudanum, quickly dismissed as a personal remedy. A rival suitor of Clara's was rumored to have threatened her, but he was out of town on the day of the wedding. A letter, discovered in Clara's belongings, hinted at a secret she had been keeping, but its contents were maddeningly vague, reference to the burden I must bear and the danger that lies ahead. Finch followed each lead, only to find himself circling back to the same questions, the same faces. The pressure mounted. The newspapers demanded answers, their headlines growing more lurid with each passing day. The Winthrops, desperate for closure, pressed for an arrest. The Barretts, their reputation in tatters, hired their own investigators, muddying the waters with counter-accusations and legal threats. Finch felt the weight of the city's expectations pressing down on him, the line between justice and vengeance. Growing ever thinner. In the end, the investigation revealed as much about Hartford as it did about the crime itself. The city's faith in science was tempered by its love of gossip, its pursuit of justice undermined by its obsession with reputation. The truth, Finch realized, was not a single thread to be pulled, but a tangled web of motives, secrets, and lies. Every answer led to another question, every revelation to another shadow. And so, the case remained unresolved, the poisoner unmasked, the city forever changed. The people of Hartford would remember the tragedy for years to come, each retelling, adding new details, new suspects, new theories. The line between fact and fiction blurred, the truth lost in the shadows. If you had been in Detective Finch's shoes, Would you have trusted the evidence or the whispers of the crowd? Would you have risked your own reputation to pursue justice, or turned away to protect your place in society? In the end, the investigation was not just a search for a killer, but a reckoning with the darkness that lives in every community. A darkness that, once revealed, can never be fully banished. The day of reckoning arrived with a cold, relentless rain that seemed to wash the color from Hartford streets. The city, so recently alive with wedding bells and laughter, now braced itself for a different kind of spectacle. In the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation and dread. The Winthrops sat together, their faces drawn and pale, while the Barretts occupied the opposite bench, a family united in public, but fractured in every other way. Lydia Barrett, the woman at the center of it all, sat perfectly still, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the reach of the crowd. Detective Finch took the stand, his testimony a careful weaving of fact and inference. He spoke of the arsenic found in Clara's body, the traces discovered in the shattered glass, the inconsistencies in the servants' accounts. He described Lydia's movements on the day of the wedding, her presence in the kitchen, her insistence on overseeing the champagne. Each detail was a thread, and as Finch spoke, the threads tightened around Lydia like a noose. The courtroom listened in rapt silence as the evidence mounted. The apothecary, pale and sweating, admitted to selling arsenic to the Barrett household, though he claimed it was for rat poison. A servant recalled seeing Lydia alone in the pantry, her hands trembling as she measured something into a small vial. Another remembered the strange metallic scent that lingered in the air after Lydia left the kitchen. The glass itself, when produced, seemed almost to glow with menace, a simple vessel transformed into an instrument of death. Lydia's defense was as brittle as porcelain. Her lawyer argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the city's grief had curdled into hysteria, that Lydia was the victim of a witch hunt fueled by envy and old grudges. He pointed to the lack of direct witnesses, the gaps in the timeline, the possibility that someone else, anyone else, could have slipped the poison into Clara's drink. But the tide had turned. The city wanted a villain, and Lydia, with her cold beauty and iron will, fit the role too perfectly. The confrontation between Lydia and Jonathan was the final shattering blow. Called to the stand, Jonathan's voice trembled as he recounted the last moments of his wife's life. He spoke of Lydia's warnings, her veiled criticisms, the way she had hovered over Clara with a possessiveness that bordered on obsession. When asked if he believed his mother capable of murder, Jonathan hesitated, his face contorted with grief and disbelief. I don't know, he whispered, the words hanging in the air like a curse. I want to believe she couldn't, but I saw the way she looked at Clara. I saw the fear in her eyes. Lydia's composure finally cracked. For the first time, tears welled in her eyes, her mask slipping to reveal the raw, desperate woman. Beneath, she stood, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "You think you know me," she cried, her words trembling with rage and sorrow. "You think you understand what it means to fight for your family, to sacrifice everything for their future. I did what I had to do. I did what any mother would do." The courtroom recoiled, the horror of her confession settling over them. Like a shroud, the verdict, when it came, was almost an afterthought. Lydia Barrett was found guilty of murder, sentenced to life in prison. The city exhaled, relief and revulsion mingling in equal measure. The Winthrops retreated into their grief, their family name forever stained by tragedy. The Barretts, once the darlings of Hartford society, became pariahs, their fortune and reputation shattered beyond repair. Jonathan disappeared from public life, his heart broken, his future a blank page. But as the weeks turned to months, questions lingered. Was Lydia truly guilty, or had she been sacrificed to satisfy the city's hunger for justice? Had the investigation, uncovered the whole truth, or merely the most convenient version. Some whispered that others had motive, that the poison could have come from another hand. Others insisted that Lydia's madness was the real culprit, that she had been driven to the brink by a lifetime of pressure and disappointment. And what of justice? Was it served by the spectacle of a ruined family, by the imprisonment of a Sia, woman who had once commanded the city's respect? Or was the true crime the secrets that remained, the wounds that would never heal? The story of Clara Winthrop Barrett's death became a cautionary tale, a ghost story whispered in the halls of Hartford's grandest homes. But the truth, as always, remained elusive, flickering in the shadows just beyond the reach of the light. So I ask you, was justice truly served? Or did Hartford, in its desperation for closure, destroy more than it saved? The answers, like the poison in the cup, are hidden in plain sight, waiting for those brave enough to look. In the months and years that followed the trial, the tragedy of Clara Winthrop Barrett's wedding day cast a long, unyielding shadow over Hartford. The city, once so eager to feast on the scandal, now found itself haunted by the consequences. The Winthrop and Barrett names, once spoken with admiration or envy, became synonymous with sorrow and suspicion. Their grand homes, once the sites of glittering parties and whispered alliances, grew quiet, their windows shuttered against the world. For the Winthrops, grief became a permanent guest. Eleanor, never fully recovering from the loss of her only daughter, withdrew from society, her health failing as the years wore on. Charles, his pride broken, sold off parcels of the family estate to pay mounting debts. Each transaction a small surrender to the relentless march of time. The family's legacy, so carefully tended for generations, faded into obscurity, their story reduced to a cautionary tale told in hushed tones. The Barretts fared no better. Samuel, once a man of boundless ambition, found himself shunned by former friends and business partners. His fortune dwindled, his reputation irreparably tarnished by the scandal. He spent his final years in isolation, haunted by the memory of a wife he could neither save nor forgive. Jonathan, the golden son, vanished from Hartford altogether. Some said he traveled west, seeking anonymity in the gold fields of California or the wilds of Colorado. Others claimed he was seen in New York, a shadow among the crowds, forever marked by the tragedy he could not escape. No one knew for certain. His absence became just another mystery in a story already thick with unanswered questions. And Lydia, her fate, was the most chilling of all. Imprisoned in a cold stone cell, she became a figure of fascination and fear. Some pitied her, imagining her as a victim of her own ambition and the impossible standards of her time. Others saw her as a monster, a cautionary example of what could happen when a woman's will outstripped her place in society. She died alone, her name spoken only in whispers, her grave unmarked and forgotten. But the story did not die with her. In Hartford, the tale of the poisoned bride became a kind of local legend, retold at firesides and in schoolyards, embroidered with each retelling. Some claimed to have seen Clara's ghost wandering the old Winthrop garden, her white dress trailing through the mist. Others swore that Lydia's spirit haunted the courthouse, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls at night. The facts of the case blurred with fiction, the line between truth and myth dissolving as the years passed. The psychological scars ran deeper than any public reckoning. Families who had once counted the Winthrops or Barretts as friends now kept their distance, wary of being drawn into the lingering web of suspicion. Young women, once eager to marry into Hartford's elite, grew cautious, their mothers warning them that even the grandest wedding could end in ruin. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next tragedy to strike. Yet, in the quiet spaces between the rumors and the regrets, there were moments of reflection. Some saw in the story a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition. the corrosive power of envy, and the fragility of reputation. Others found in it a kind of dark comfort, a reminder that even the most privileged lives are not immune to suffering, that beneath every polished surface lies a world of secrets and pain. Over time, the details faded, but the questions remained. Was Lydia Barrett truly guilty, or merely a scapegoat for a city desperate to protect its own illusions? Did justice bring peace, or only more sorrow? And what, if anything, could have been done to prevent such a tragedy? In the end, the story of the tragic wedding became part of Hartford's very bones, a ghostly echo that lingered long after the last mourner had gone home, a reminder that the past is never truly buried, and that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. What is it that truly poisons a family? Is it a single act of malice, or the slow accumulation of secrets, resentments, and unspoken fears? The story of Clara Winthrop Barrett's wedding is more than a tale of Victorian tragedy. It is a mirror, held up to the darkness that can fester within even the most respectable homes. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to restore. Love, when twisted by jealousy or control, can become a weapon sharper than any blade. We like to believe that such horrors belong to another era, that our modern world with its science, its laws, its transparency, would never allow such a tragedy to unfold. But is that really true? How many families today hide their wounds behind closed doors, presenting a perfect image to the world while suffering in silence? How often do ambition, pride, or fear drive us to betray those we claim to love? Could this happen today? Could a mother's love curdle into something deadly, unnoticed until it is too late? Or have we simply become better at disguising the poison within? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a family torn apart by secrets or suspicion? Do you believe justice was truly served in Hartford? Or was the real poison something deeper, something that lingers long after the headlines fade? Your stories, your questions, your reflections, they are what keep these shadows alive, and what may, in the end, help us find the light. Thank you for joining me on this journey into Hartford's darkest hour. If this story left you questioning the nature of trust, or wondering what secrets might lie behind the doors of your own community, I invite you to share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales where history and horror intertwine, and share this video with someone who loves a good mystery. Next time, we'll uncover another chilling chapter from the shadows of the past, one that may haunt your dreams long after the screen goes dark. Until then, remember, sometimes the greatest dangers come from those closest to us. Stay curious, stay cautious, and I'll see you in the next story.